Okay, let's make a start. Welcome, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us here at this online workshop about the role of chefs in our sustainable food system. My name is Michael Creek. I'm from Sticky Dots, based in Brussels, in Belgium, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating this workshop and welcoming you all. It's great to see so many of you from so many different countries already. I think this will promises to be a lively and diverse debate. We're really looking forward to hearing from all of you later in the session. This workshop is co-hosted by SAPEA and the Chefs Manifesto, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the two organizations. How did this workshop come about? This is not a new conversation, the role of chefs in our sustainable food system. But last year in spring 2020, SAPEA launched an evidence review report about sustainable food systems. So SAPEA stands for Science Advice for Policy by European academies. And its role is to gather scientific evidence for policymaking. And it's across a whole range of topics. And so this particular report was on the topic of sustainable food systems in our future, looking at how do we ensure food security while maintaining sustainability for people and planet. So this report, you can see it here on the left, was launched, and it informed an opinion produced by the group of chief scientific advisors for the European Union, which you see here in the middle. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about this evidence review report from two of its authors, who are here in the workshop. We'll also be hearing a lot more about the Chefs Manifesto, which a lot of you know very well already. For those of you who don't, it's the Chefs Manifesto Action Plan was launched in 2018, and it's a document put together by chefs, for chefs, looking at the role of chefs in sustainable food futures. The network now counts over 700 chefs from 77 countries, so it's no coincidence that so many of you here today from such a wide variety of places. And so on this call, we're delighted to be joined by representatives of the Chefs Manifesto and of SAPEA. So we'll hear from Professor Peter Jackson, who is Professor and Co-Director of the Institute for Sustainable Food at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And he chaired the SAPEA working group that produced this evidence review report. And we'll also hear from Marianne Penker, who is Professor at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, in Austria. And she was part of the working group behind the report as well. On the chef's side, we're really happy to welcome Chantal Nicholson from New Zealand, but now based in the UK, chef patron at Treadwell's and Group Operations Director for Marcus Waring Restaurants. And we're very happy to have with us Megha Kohli, who is head chef at Lavash Bisabi, the Armenian restaurant in New Delhi in India. And they'll be joining Paul Newnham in conversation, who you will know as director of the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, and who of course led the establishment of the Chefs Manifesto. And he's of course joining us from Australia, so it's a real mix even among the panel themselves. So I'd like to welcome our first two speakers, Peter Jackson and Marianne Penker. So as I said, they have produced last year this SAPEA report, the evidence review report, on looking at scientific evidence that supports European policy on our sustainable food futures. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter and Marianne. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for warming up the audience so effectively. I'm going to speak first and then hand over to Marianne. We're only going to speak for about 15 minutes between ourselves to make sure there's plenty of time for discussion. So as Michael said, last year I had the honour of chairing a working group to review evidence about the sustainability, or perhaps the lack of sustainability, of the European food system. It was considered that there was a broad consensus about the natural science evidence on sustainability, and we were asked to focus specifically on social science research and evidence of what some people call what works in policy terms. So we reviewed academic papers and grey literature to show the way in which different kinds of policies did or didn't have positive outcomes in terms of sustainability. And broadly, our conclusion was that the evidence showed that a mix of hard and soft measures was required to make food system change. So hard measures would include things like taxation and other fiscal measures. Softer measures would be things like health advice or consumer education and campaigning. And the literature suggests that the soft measures on their own are not sufficient. So our review concluded that the current food system isn't sustainable, that business as usual is not a viable option going forward, and that more radical change is required. As Michael sketched out in that introduction, the evidence review was passed on to the Commission's group of chief scientific advisors. They wrote a scientific opinion, and that then informed the Commission's new farm to fork strategy. And although that's rather an elaborate process, it's important that there is a separation between the gathering of evidence and the formulation of policy. In other words, it's important that we as academics doing the evidence review have independence from the policy process. We're free from lobbying or accusations of political bias. So hopefully the SAPEA report stands as a balanced and fair review of evidence on which policymakers can then go to work. The report made the case for thinking in system terms rather than a simple linear path from production to consumption. This is consistent with those of you interested in moving towards a more circular economy designed to reduce or eliminate waste. It's also important, system thinking, to avoid unintended consequences. In other words, where an intervention at one part of the system could have unintended consequences elsewhere in the system. So, for example, if we manage to force a change towards more organic food production, that might then increase food miles if organic food has to be imported from elsewhere in the world. Or if we favour a drive towards self-sufficiency for each nation state, that might not produce the most resilient outcome. Trade between nations, suitably regulated, can be just as good or indeed more sustainable than relying on self-sufficient member states. So our report documented the consequences of the current intensive industrialized food system in terms of its negative consequences for biodiversity, for environmental pollution, and public health. We also noted the evidence that the food system is responsible for around 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, as reported by the IPCC report in 2019. The food system is, in other words, a significant contributor to climate change. And like climate change, the need for policy change and changes in behaviour are urgent. I like to say they're measured in years or decades rather than generations. So the report, which I hope you'll at least have a look at, there's a very good executive summary at the beginning, so you don't have to read the whole report. The report has chapters on some of the key issues and global challenges, about understanding sustainable food systems, the evaluation of recent policy initiatives, questions of governance and power, identifying agents of change within the food system, and importantly, we think, identifying examples of good practice on which the EU can build. So those good practice examples aren't picked at random, they're ones where there is good, documented, peer-reviewed evidence of their effectiveness. I think you already see that there's lots of overlap between our report and the Chefs Manifesto's thematic areas: protection of biodiversity, waste reduction, an increase in local and seasonal food, a shift to plant-based ingredients, a push for more healthy diets, and accessible, affordable food for all. So I think there's lots of kind of agreement and common ground between the two organisations involved in today's meeting. I thought I should say a word about the COVID-19 pandemic. Our report came out just as the first lockdown was occurring, and we had to put a little note at the beginning to remind readers of that when they come to see this in future years. But I think it's symptomatic that media attention across Europe has focused on things like empty supermarket shelves and accusations of panic buying by consumers, or it's focused on the rise of food poverty and the increasing numbers of people having recourse to emergency food provision in food banks and so on. And it's certainly true that in the UK, at least, 1 in 5 households has cut down on meals since 2020 for financial reasons. So these are big issues, but I think there's much less media coverage of the effects of the temporary closure or the restricted opening hours of pubs and restaurants, which of course, you'll know better than me, has been a massive problem for the food service sector. More generally, I think COVID-19 has highlighted the vulnerability of the food system. So it might have bounced back after the first few weeks of shortages when just-in-time delivery systems temporarily failed. So some people would argue that the bounce back shows that the food system is fine, thank you very much. But we think that the impact of COVID-19 has shown the longer-term implications in terms of health and sustainability that the food system is currently facing. So one more set of points, and then I'll hand over to Marianne. We're interested in then today what the role of chefs and restaurants might be in producing a more sustainable food system. Our report identifies a wide range of what we call food system actors, from farmers to food processors, manufacturers and retailers, regulators and educators. But there is, I think, surprisingly little attention to chefs or restaurants in our report. Obviously, we look back at the report in preparation for today's meeting, and I was certainly surprised by that. You can certainly argue, and you all know, that chefs and restaurants are key intermediaries in the journey of food from farm to fork. So it's a really good place to look for what are the possibilities of change within the food system. So as Marianne will talk about more in a moment, the Chefs Manifesto members are clearly agents of change in the food system. Just before I finish, though, I'd like to take an example from an organisation called the Sustainable Restaurants Association, with whom we've been having discussions here in Sheffield over the last few weeks. They have lots of exciting ideas, I'm sure similar to those of the Chefs Manifesto group, in terms of providing sustainability information on menus. So not just ingredients or nutritional information, but information about sustainability of the ingredients that are being used. They have a net zero restaurant protocol, which restaurants can sign up to and get endorsements for. They are experimenting with a climate charge on the bill and using tools for measuring the biodiversity impact of different ingredients. So there are lots of specific things that we could talk about in terms of helping restaurants and chefs push towards a more sustainable food system. So I'll hand over to Marianne now, who's going to say a little bit more about chefs as agents of change and some examples of good practice. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm coming here from Vienna and happy to join this meeting. Thank you also, Peter, for presenting already the context of this report and also the urgency behind it. I want to briefly summarize 3 types of knowledge. First, the knowledge we put together on the problem. Then our knowledge that we have found on the vision of a sustainable food system. So how could this look like? And third, the knowledge on how we can get from today's problems to the future of the more sustainable food system. And here specifically the role of narratives and the role of chefs as storytellers, educators, and community builders, and here clearly also as agents of change. So first, if we look at the evidence, we have a very clear and consistent picture that the current food system fails in 3 huge issues. There are 3 inabilities. So first, there's an inability of the system to feed today's and future world population with healthy food. On the one hand, we have hundreds of millions of people faced with chronic undernourishment, while on the other side, we have more than twice the number of people affected by overweight, obesity. And adipositas has moved up the ladder of top mortality causes in the last decades, bringing huge health issues, not only the global north, but also in the global south. The second inability of the system is that it cannot produce equal and equitable benefits. And here again, the pandemic really shows and increases that we have the picture of a problem, thinking of migrant workers, farm workers, but also workers in slaughterhouses. I think this is a big issue in Europe, but maybe also in other parts of the world. And third, Peter has already mentioned the climate change, but there are also another a big number of environmental challenges, like the mass extinction of plant and animal species, or the phosphorus and nitrogen flows transgressing the safe operating space on our planet. So we have clear evidence that the current food system produces huge health, environmental and social problems. So how could a sustainable food system look like? And in the report, we put together a definition which is similar to many other definitions of a sustainable food system. I'm reading to you: a sustainable food system provides safe, nutritious and healthy food of low environmental impact to all, in a manner that is robust, resilient, economically dynamic, just and fair, and socially acceptable and inclusive. And here, as we have here a very international audience, I think very important is also this last sentence. It does so without compromising the availability of nutritious and healthy food for people living on other continents, nor impairing their natural environment. So pointing at also the SDGs perspective that we need a global solution for global problems. So we know the problem, we have quite a good idea where we want to go. So what's the vision of the future sustainable food system? What is the knowledge on the transition path? So how can we manage the transition from today to the sustainable food system? And here in the report, we argue that different framings of food suggest different transition pathways. The dominant framing of food in European policies, so in agricultural policy, but also in international trade policy, is food is a commodity. However, food is much more than a commodity. Food is joy, it's culture, it's identity, it's a common good, it's a human right. It's also people's closest link to nature. With each meal, literally, we are incorporating parts of nature, so parts of plants, parts of animals. So this is where humans have the closest link to nature. And depending on these framings, people ask for different measures. So different framings suggest different transition paths, different policy measures. For example, those framing food as a commodity, they see the responsibility with consumers, and they would argue for measures like improving education, information, choice architecture should be improved. We need food labels. However, evidence shows a fundamental asymmetry between, or in the information and in the power along the supply chain. Just thinking of all the money going in food advertisements, and we have clear evidence that there is a correlation between food advertisement on the one hand and consumer behavior on the other hand. So today's consumers, I would argue, also in view of knowledge gaps and time constraints, face huge difficulties in acting sustainably. So those framing food as human right, they ask for state intervention, such as food procurement policies or healthy meals in schools, hospital care facilities, laws stopping the exploitation of migrant workers, equitable access to means of production. And those framing food as common good, this is here the last example I want to put forward, they would see the responsibility with the community. And for them, we would need to encourage food councils or community food strategies, so involve citizens, local citizens, in formulating sustainable food policies. So what is now the role of the chefs? Peter already highlighted that there was not much attention in our report to this very important group of chefs as intermediaries between producers, consumers. Nevertheless, we pointed at 3 key roles. The first is that they are key storytellers, shaping the narratives of food. If you think, for example, that the Singapore restaurant that recently offered for the first time lab-grown meat, or if you think of the French restaurant owner, they have received, I think some days ago, the Michelin star. So it's a fully vegan restaurant receiving this Michelin star. It's the second one. I think there is another one in New York. So they tell 2 quite different stories of a sustainable food future. And I think apart from this high-end gastronomy, it's the many chiefs out there like you, you have really the opportunity to contribute to a change in norms of ethical and tasty food. You can act as, and you act, as we see already in the chat, as ambassador, a storyteller. You let the consumers know where the food comes from, tell them the real stories. So fighting against the fake news we see on food advertisements. Literature also shows that maybe more important than knowledge, however, might be skills and passion for sustainable food, for food growing, for food crafting. And I'm sure many of you are involved in cooking events, in social media activities, in workshops, where you hand over important knowledge to people, for example, how to avoid food waste by using the animals from nose to tail, or vegetables from root to leaf, how to cook delicious meals from seasonally and locally sourced food rich in plant proteins and micronutrients. So I think skills and passion is a very important ingredient as well. And the third role that we pointed out in the report is the building and the empowerment of communities. Like the Chefs Manifesto, you came together and to advocate for sustainability transition. But there are also many local initiatives, for example, again on food waste, where you come together and also advocate for social inclusion, handing over meat to others who are more in need of it, improving infrastructure for local food production, and so on. So to sum up, we have in our report a very robust evidence that the current food system is not sustainable, huge health, environmental and social problems. We have quite a clear vision of a sustainable food system. However, the different framings of food, so is it a commodity, is it a common good, or is it a human right, suggest different responsibilities and also measures how to manage this transition from today's system to the future more sustainable food system. And chefs have a key role as storytellers, reframing the narrative on food, as educators, and as community builders. And I would like to stop here. Thank you.